Hey guys, it's Aman
and Christina
from Our Rich Journey. We are back in the US of A. In fact, we are in New York City. After living in Portugal for 2 years, we have not been back to the US once. And so this is our first trip back. And we have been here for some time, and we have an opinion to share with you. Because if you have been following our journey, you know that Christina and I achieved financial independence and we moved to Portugal. And we have been living there for the past 2 years. In fact, we have dug roots so deep, we bought 2 homes in Portugal. And our kids go to Portuguese school. And we have just been enjoying our time in Portugal. But we have yet to come back to the US. And so in this video, what we want to share are our first impressions of being here, but not just being anywhere, being in New York City.
So in this video, we are going to give you our first impressions now that we have arrived back in America after being in Portugal for more than 2 years. And we're also going to answer the question of whether or not we see ourselves ever coming back and permanently living here in the United States. But before we get to that, if you are new to our channel is all about making, saving, and investing money on the road to financial independence and retiring early. Aman and I pursued financial independence for 8 years. We reached our goal and we retired early before the age of 40. So if you are interested in learning more ways to make, save, and invest money on the road to financial independence and retiring early, make sure you subscribe to our channel and follow us on Instagram.
But before we get into our first impressions, I do have to tell a very quick story of what happened to us when we arrived in New York City at the airport. As we were going through customs, the customs officer was asking us some questions about what's bringing us back to the US, how long have we been away, how long are we staying? And one of the questions he asked us is, what do you do for a living? And Christina and I said, we don't work. And his follow-up question was, how are you paying for this trip? And it just shocked us. We were like, well, it kind of threw us back for a moment. And Christina immediately inserted and said, well, we're paying from our investments. And so it hadn't occurred to us how strange it sounds to people when we tell people that we are retired, that we don't work anymore. You know, when we tell people that in Portugal, we don't get as many questions. But as soon as we landed here in America, it was just so interesting to get that type of question about our finances.
So that was just a quick side note of our very first experience, but let's get into our impressions. And I think one of the very first things that we noticed was the sounds, the smells. Everything seemed very elevated. Like we were very super sensitive to these things as we were driving through to get to New York City. So this is in contrast to where we are in Portugal. We live in the Silver Coast and everything just seems so mellow and so calm. But we also lived in Lisbon and we didn't have that very hypersensitive activity going around us in Lisbon. So we just really felt that energy right when we came into New York City, and our whole experience here has been just a lot of sensory overload here in New York City.
And you know what? We've lived abroad before and have come back to the United States, and we've had this same kind of culture sensitivity shock. One of the things that always surprises us is how we can hear almost every conversation around us. You see, when we are living in Portugal, we tend to kind of drown out some of the background noise behind us because there's so much Portuguese going on that we can't really comprehend everything that's happening. We have to really focus in on conversations to understand them. But here in New York City, it seems like we can hear everyone's conversation at once. And we joke about it all the time. We call it ear hustling because we are just eating it up. We're like, did you hear what they just said? So being away for so long, the first thing that surprised us the most was just how hypersensitive we were with all of our senses. So this brings us to our next impression. After all the hypersensitivity had calmed down a bit, we started to focus on our hunger. And one of the things that we love is we love Mexican food. Now, coming from California, we have some of the best Mexican food, and we wanted to see how New York City stacked up to that. So the first place we went was to a Mexican restaurant that we had researched. Now, the meal was amazing. The portions were huge. And then the bill came. And that's the second thing that shocked us the most, was the cost of food.
So that was our first impression. The prices were much more expensive here. Our lunch at the Mexican restaurant for a family of 4, and it is lunchtime, was $120.
I almost fell out of the seat. Now, maybe we weren't paying attention to the menu at the time because we were so hungry, but to get a bill that high, when you consider what food costs in Portugal, I mean, we could have gone out to eat 3 or 4 times for what this bill cost.
But it wasn't just the bill for food. We've noticed that everything here in New York City costs a lot more, sometimes even more than 10 times more compared to prices in Portugal. So I'll give you a more concrete example. When we were living in Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, we lived in a super nice area in Lisbon, and we rented a 3-bedroom, 2-bath apartment, and the rent was less than $2,000 a month. Now, when we were out and about in New York City, we found a sign for an apartment to rent in Chelsea. We looked it up. It was a 2-bedroom apartment, and it was $9,150 a month for rent.
I remember when we looked up that apartment. $9,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment. I mean, Chelsea is a beautiful neighborhood, but $9,000, that completely shocked us. I still cannot wrap my head around what people are paying for rent in New York City. But I guess that is just all a part of living in New York City. It is an expensive city to live in. But we've been to big cities before, and we've looked at real estate in other places. But it just seems like rent has just gotten out of control to a whole nother level. And now, if you are pursuing financial independence with the dreams of retiring early, your cost of housing is such a huge expense that you must be able to lock down. You don't want to have housing prices that are going to be all over the place. So one of the nice things about us living in Portugal is that we own our home completely. We paid cash for it, so we don't have a mortgage. If we lived here in New York City, I just can't even imagine how we would handle housing. But this is just another expense. Our next observation along the lines of money has to do with tipping. Now, Christina and I believe wholeheartedly in tipping. But having lived in Europe and having lived in parts of Asia, we realize that tipping is something that really only takes place in the US. And so whenever we come back to the US, it always takes a little bit of adjustment for us to get used to tipping again. But tipping in New York City is like a whole nother level of tipping. Now, we've been to restaurants, cafes, everywhere you can imagine that typically requires a tip. But we have been surprised at some of the other establishments where they are also asking for tips. And one in particular just shocked us. It was at the grocery store. Now, I've never been to a grocery store, purchased groceries, and at the checkout, there's an option to place a tip at the grocery store. This completely surprised us.
Our next impression has to deal with food, since I feel like we're sort of on a food theme, but this one has to deal with our experience at restaurants, but just the overall experience. When we're here eating out in New York City, I feel like the experience is a little rushed. I feel like they clean your plates out very quickly. They give you your bill before you ask for the bill. It's like they're trying to cycle people in and out very quickly, and that is the complete opposite of our experience in Portugal while we're eating.
So this was really surprising because there was one restaurant where Malia still had half her burrito to eat. But because we eat at a very slow pace, we had no expectation of leaving anytime soon. But the waiters and the waitresses started to come over and take plates off of our table. Like Christina said, that would never happen in Portugal. You could be at a Portuguese restaurant for literally 3 or 4 hours eating your meal if you wanted to, and you would never feel rushed. But here, that is not the case. And I can recall when we moved from the US to Portugal, we would eat our meals so fast that it took us some time just to get used to eating slower. Our next observation has to do with the people. Now, before we came to New York City, we were preparing ourselves for people that were gonna be abrasive and maybe rude, Whatever the case, any type of stereotype that you could think of New York City, we were preparing ourselves for that type of experience. But we have experienced the absolute opposite. People have been so friendly in every neighborhood that we have gone to.
Yeah, I think there are definitely stereotypes about people in New York City, like they're always rushed, they may not be as pleasant as other places, but we found, we are tourists here. We are trying to figure out how to get from A to Z or get on the subway line, but when we ask people, do we go this way to 5th Street or that way, or where do we go to get here, which subway line do we get on, we found that every single person has been so super generous with their time and really talking to us and really describing where we need to go, or just talking about New York City in general. We've just had a really great experience with our interactions here.
So this brings us to our next observation, and this one is very interesting because for a city as big and as wild as New York City, there sure are a lot of rules. There are signs everywhere telling you what you can and can't do, places you can and can't go. One of the signs that we see all the time that just makes us laugh is this no standing anytime sign. And they are everywhere. So it almost epitomizes what New York City is. It is a city that is always moving. In fact, it is against the rules in some places to just be standing there. You gotta keep it moving, buddy.
So this leads to our last impression of New York City, and that has to deal with class disparity. When we arrived in New York, as we're driving around, as we've been walking throughout the city, we noticed a huge disparity between the different classes. So it's very obvious if you're going through the subways, if you're walking down the streets, you see people that are very, very well off, and then you see people that are completely struggling in the same area, and you see it repeatedly over and over again, and it's so prominent throughout the city that it's something that you're very aware of when you're just walking around the city.
Now, on the other hand, in Portugal, you don't see that type of class disparity when you're around the city. In Lisbon in particular, we didn't notice that type of class disparity as huge as it is here in New York City. So this was something that, for us, it was a real shock to see such extremes in certain situations. And it brought up a lot of really good conversations about life here in New York City as opposed to life in Portugal. And we had some great conversations with our daughters about it.
So speaking of conversations with our daughters, one of the things that we did here in the city was we went to NYU. We looked at the different campus buildings. We went to the bookstore. We went to the library. We even talked to students that are currently going to NYU. And this is all because our oldest daughter is really interested in potentially attending school at NYU. So that leads to our next part, our last part of this video really, which is discussing whether or not we see ourselves ultimately coming back to the States and living back here in the States permanently.
Now, if it was up to Christina, she would follow our children no matter where they went. So if Sanoa moved to New York City, she'd be like, okay, we're moving to New York City, but I'd be like, we're not paying $9,000 for an apartment. But seriously, Christina and I want to stay connected with our children no matter where they go to school. So if our daughters go to New York or California, wherever the case may be, we are going to be going to visit them as often as possible. But moving back to the US, we just cannot see ourselves doing it. There are so many wonderful things about the US, and we love this country. But we really consider Portugal our home, our forever home. But it doesn't mean that we won't be coming back to the US to visit as often as possible. I mean, we have to fill up on all this glorious food, and we have to connect with our American brothers and sisters. And so, to the question of whether or not we see ourselves ever living in the US, the answer is probably no, but you can never say never. So I'll just leave it at that.
So with that said, we are still going to be here in New York for the next couple of days. If you guys actually live in New York City, or if you visited New York City and you're really familiar with it, please leave a comment below and give us some ideas of what you think we should see. Maybe we haven't seen it yet, but of course, if you like this video, make sure you like, subscribe, and join the journey.